Hi again then guys, and welcome to, of course, another breakdown of a specific car from the GT Sport roster. And some of you might be thinking, hang on a second, this isn't a DLC car, this isn't an update, this isn't from a pack, this car was already in the game, so why are we talking about it? Well, the reason why is because, believe it or not, despite the fact that GT Sport is so much more limited in terms of the amount of cars compared to all of the previous games, we still haven't looked at them all, because of course every month we've had updates to talk about, we've had tuning to do, we've had news, top 10 breakdowns, various other things that we also do on the channel, so there is still a surprising amount of cars that we have not yet looked at. And of course that will come to an end eventually, but for the moment there are still a fair few left. So what I basically do is, between the coverage of each new update, which tends to be very popular, you guys love those videos for obvious reasons, and the coverage of the actual updates themselves and all of the cars they're in, there tends to be a little window of opportunity each month between when we've stopped talking about the cars that we've just got and haven't quite got the new ones yet, when we've got, say, a week or so where we can talk about some of the cars that we hadn't got around to, or do some tunes for them. And this is one of those occasions. It's a car that was in the game from day one, a new game for, or a new car I should say, for Gran Turismo Sport. We did not have this in any of the previous Gran Turismo games, but it's a car which, kind of spoiler alert, is a vehicle that I've never been on the train for. And I know that this car has tons of fans, especially the higher grade models like the race car and the GTR, the green one. I can see why people would love it, but for me it's just one of those times where everybody loves something and I just don't. It doesn't do it for me. No version of the AMG GT has ever appealed to me whatsoever. I consider it to be watered down compared to the SLS, which I was also not much of a fan of apart from the electric version. To me, the pinnacle was the SLR, and everything since then has kind of got slower and more watered down in comparison, as far as supercars go at least, and to the point where this one is not even a supercar anymore. This is a super sports car, whereas you could argue legitimately that the SLS was still a supercar, although not at the level of a CLK GTR or an SLR for the most part. This one though, to me, there's no question, this is not a supercar, it's a super sport, especially if Nissan themselves categorise the GTR as a super sports car and not a supercar. No way is this a supercar in comparison. So it's got the luxury factor of a Mercedes, it's well made, well engineered, understated compared to the previous efforts in the exotic category of Mercedes models, which to me is a bad thing. To others I'm sure that's a good thing, and to some degree the GTR fills that void. It's the more crazy one, but with personal preference, which I always discuss but also put to one side for the sake of a review. What if I do just that? What if I put my personal dislike for the car, or to be honest, just apathy? I don't hate the car, I just don't care for it. What if I put that to one side and then do what we always do? Put on my salesman cap and tell you exactly what you need to know about the car and what kind of driver it can appeal to and whether or not you should potentially buy one. Well, let's do just that. So what do you get? Well, the engine is a 4 litre, which is again considerably smaller than the previous supercars and super sports cars before it. You're looking at just over 500 horsepower, which is not bad, of course, 502. It's got a decent amount of torque, which is not at all surprising for a Mercedes, just under 480 pound-feet. And even the weight is actually pretty good. It's lighter than the SLS, the SLR. Of course, it's not lighter than the CLK GTR. It weighs 1,570 kilos, which is pretty good for a long-distance GT, exotic, super sport, you know, whatever title you want to put on it. The horsepower per tonne is 320, again, pretty decent, especially for a car that doesn't exactly have earth-shattering power. And as far as the pricing, well, of course it's 6 figures, it's an exotic Mercedes, it's never going to be anything else, but I would say that 184,000 credits is modest. Especially when you consider, for instance, that that's a good 70 grand less than the original Porsche GT3 that we had in the game from day one. So that compares pretty well. But what then about its performance? How does it compare on the track? What kind of potential does it have? When you tune it, for instance, what kind of categories can it end up in? Well, as far as tuning, it's actually very, very responsive, because fully tuned, this car has 905 brake horsepower. That's really good for a 4 litre that doesn't have anywhere near that to begin with, so it's very, very responsive to tuning. As far as how it actually performs, Well, unsurprisingly to anyone, it's similar to the SLS in some ways, but I will say that despite the fact that I'm not a fan of it, and I do prefer the SLS overall, I will say that the GTS definitely feels more compact, more nimble, and lighter, which it is, compared to the SLS. The SLS feels like even more of a tourer, whereas this feels a little bit more of almost like an overpowered sports car. Whereas the SLS is a true supersports exotic, borderline supercar, this one doesn't feel like that. This one feels more like a sports car, which is then technically also a supersport, if you know what I mean. Almost like one category lower, but kind of all the better for it in that sort of way, which is an interesting approach from Mercedes to make it that much slower and that much less powerful than the SLS was, but still to make it a successful car. Almost like this is the ultimate incarnation of an SLK in a funny kind of way, that more chunky, very ball of power looking kind of car that the SLK always was, especially the later AMG models like the SLK 55. So in that way, and from that point of view, I can certainly see the appeal. It's got what I would call the bulldog factor, where it's this little aggressive, very attitude-driven vehicle, and you can feel that for sure, almost like a spiritual successor to a TVR in some senses, and I can appreciate that as much as the next guy, but in terms of trackability and racing ability, it is admittedly limited. You can get it down to N400, but it's a fraction too high in terms of power to get into N300, which is a shame. It would have been cool for that, but N400 is its lower limit, of course, around, what is it, N900 it must be, yeah, 905 horsepower as its upper limit, so it's got pretty good range. But in terms of trackability, it can be beaten. Of course, it can be beaten by stuff like the F-Type Jaguar, it can easily be beaten by the Porsche GT3, in fact a couple of the Porsches could wipe the floor with this thing, and it's not that it's a bad car. I would actually, kind of ironically, put this in the same camp as the Maserati. And just like I said in that Maserati review, the reason why I say that is because there are just certain cars that you cannot fully appreciate in a game in terms of the things that they offer. A Tesla, for instance. It's practical, it has 7 seats, but in a game that means nothing. It's only about how fast it can go. Likewise with the Maserati. Maseratis aren't about being the fastest, they're about being different, being unique, being exclusive, and being exquisite. Just like a number of other cars. You could even say that about Pagani. You could say it about Spiker, and a number of other cars that I love. Marcos, TVR. That is their kind of mantra. And it works beautifully in real life, but in a game it just doesn't, because in a game it's survival of the fittest, and that's why people tend to go for the same kind of things all the time, like Nissan GTRs, because they just get the job done. So overall, I would say that this is certainly a car that you could use and try to win with. It has the potential, that's for sure. It's certainly not slow, but it's almost a little bit too civilized, maybe a little bit too heavy for its own good when it comes to actual competition racing. And again, that's, I would say, more the fault of the N-Class system than of the car itself. The car can't help being heavier. That's just the kind of car that it was born to be. But the N-Class systems are inaccurate because you put in a car that could be super lightweight, like an Alfa 4C, say an N400, or the Porsche, which is far lighter, in N500, up against a car which just doesn't have that ability, and it never will, no matter what you do to it. It's like trying to say that you could tune a Jay Leno tank car to be somehow better than a Formula car. On paper, could that theoretically be done? Sure, but is it going to? No, you will never accomplish that. And likewise with this one. It's a good car across the board, but for racing, there are definitely better options out there, and certainly cheaper ones as well. But that's it for my thoughts on this car. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.